It happened in broad daylight, at a busy city bus stop. Phones recorded, strangers watched in disbelief, and a public figure stood face to face with rage. But what happened next shocked everyone. No shouting back. No panic. Just calm. In a world driven by outrage, one woman's silence spoke louder than the screams. This is the story you weren't ready for. Asterisk, asterisk, and everyone's talking about it. It happened in broad daylight, and nobody saw it coming. Pam Bondi, dressed elegantly in a bright pink dress that contrasted with the grayness of the city around her, stood calmly at a sunny bus stop in one of the busiest parts of downtown. The gentle morning breeze played with her hair as she checked her phone. Around her, the city moved as usual. Cars swerved past, people hustled by with coffee in hand, and others stood nearby waiting for the bus, headphones in, lost in their own worlds. Then, everything changed in an instant. A man, dressed in a dark suit and tie, stormed through the crowd with a look of pure fury on his face. His strides were heavy, determined, and fast. His eyes locked on Pam like a missile finding its target. His face was flushed red, and his fists clenched so tightly they trembled. Those nearby hadn't noticed anything unusual, not until his voice erupted from the crowd like a lightning strike. "You think you can just show up like nothing happened?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the street. Pedestrians turned instantly, startled. The sound was sharp, violent, filled with emotion. Startled, Pam turned quickly toward the voice. She blinked, confused and clearly caught off guard. Her brows furrowed as she looked at the man now just feet away from her. "I'm sorry," she said, still trying to assess the situation. "You heard me," he shouted again. "The nerve you have, standing here like you don't know what you've done. Like all those decisions meant nothing." By now, the buzz of traffic and idle chatter had faded. People stopped walking. Strangers at the bus stop stared. A few others, curious about the rising commotion, stepped closer, keeping their distance but watching attentively. Pam replied, trying to stay calm. "Sir, I don't know what you're talking about. If this is a misunderstanding." The man cut her off, pointing a trembling finger at her face. "Don't act innocent. You're public property now, Pam. We know who you are. And we haven't forgotten." His voice was loud enough to make people flinch, but Pam held her ground. Her eyes scanned the area, faces watching, cell phones beginning to rise, either to record or pretend like they were checking messages, catching every moment silently. "I'm happy to talk," Pam said, her voice even. "But this isn't the way." "Oh, now you want respect?" he mocked, smirking bitterly. "Where was your respect when people were begging for justice? When you stood beside decisions that ruin lives? You think you can dress up and walk free of consequence?" Pam opened her mouth but hesitated. Her usually sharp legal mind was now working through more than just logic. This was emotional, raw. She responded calmly but firmly, "You don't have to agree with what I've done. Many don't. But yelling at me in public doesn't make you right. It just makes you loud." Someone to the side muttered, "Wow," clearly impressed at Pam's composure. Another person whispered, "Is this really happening?" At this point, a crowd had formed, about a dozen people. Some recording, some whispering, some just stunned by the intensity. And all of them watching a powerful moment unfold in real time. The man wasn't done. He paced a few steps, his breathing heavy, his body shaking from the surge of emotion. When he turned back, however, something had shifted. The outrage remained, but the fire had dulled slightly in his eyes. "People like you don't get it," he said more softly, still angry but now tired. "You live in another world. One where words and suits cover everything. I watch families fall apart, and I remember your face on TV. Smiling, defending it all." Pam looked at him, really looked. She could see the pain that went deeper than this moment. Whatever anger this man carried, it wasn't just at her. It was about something far greater, connected to experiences that no one could forget. "I am sorry if what I did caused pain," she said quietly. "Sincerely. I may never convince you otherwise. But I'm still a person standing here just like you." Her words didn't come from defense. They came from an understanding she had learned over the course of her public life. People weren't cardboard villains or heroes. Sometimes pain didn't care about details. It just needed a voice. There was a silence. A long one. The man stood there, breathing slowly but heavily, like coming down from an emotional high. He looked around. Cameras. Judging eyes. A few sympathetic ones. He adjusted his suit, and his gaze softened, just a little. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Pam stood silently. She didn't move, didn't speak. The street was still watching. The tension in the air hadn't fully faded, but it was starting to melt. A few bystanders stepped away, unsure what else to do. But others stayed. One young man said, "That was intense." Another woman, maybe in her 50s, stepped closer to Pam. "I don't know what all this was about, but you carried yourself well," she said gently. Pam gave a small nod. "Thank you." One more woman said, "That was grace under fire." As more people began to leave, traffic returned to its normal rhythm. And slowly, the bus stop was just a bus stop again. But not for everyone. That moment, captured by at least 3 smartphones, would go on to circulate across social platforms. Some accounts posted, "Pam Bondi publicly confronted." Others twisted it to suggest scandal, while some praised her poise. But the center of it all was a human moment. Raw, unfiltered, painful, illuminating. It reminded people that while public figures often live behind microphones and podiums, they sometimes find themselves in the same places as us, facing real emotion, real criticism, and having to show real strength. Pam didn't say anything else that day. She didn't post online or give a statement. But those who saw her that morning would remember her calm, her empathy, and her refusal to escalate. Sometimes, dignity is louder than any shout. The man, voice booming with anger, pointed a trembling finger inches from her face. "How dare you show your face here after what you've done?" he yelled, his words slicing through the crisp morning air. Pam Bondi jerked slightly at the accusation, her brows pulling together in confusion. Dressed in a bright pink dress that radiated confidence and calm, she looked entirely out of place in this explosion of emotion. The man towering in front of her, his tie slightly loose and suit wrinkled from movement, was a stark contrast, fiery, disheveled, and pulsating with resentment. "Excuse me," Pam asked, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" Her tone was not defensive, not combative, but it didn't matter. The man's rage was far beyond reason. He wasn't having a conversation. He was making a statement. His face twisted as his volume increased. "You think people forget? That the city forgets?" he bellowed. "You stand for everything that's wrong with our system. You sit in your high place and watch the rest of us suffer. And now you're here, in our space, like nothing happened." The words reverberated through the open square. The crowd around them began to morph. Strangers who had been checking their watches or warming their hands on coffee cups began to pause, their attention snagged by the rising confrontation. Pam stood motionless, her expression tightening as the gravity of the situation began to settle in. Her mind raced. Who was this person? What exactly was he referring to? Was it something specific, something political? Or was this man acting from a well of generalized dissatisfaction, wrongfully targeting her as a symbol of things larger than herself? She took a small breath, trying to reply, trying to defuse. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but No," he shouted before she could finish. "You don't understand. You've never had to suffer the way we have. You speak for people in power, not for people like us. You hide behind policies and press conferences. But here, among us, you think your smile and pink dress will shield you." Pam's face remained neutral, but inside she felt a ripple of both fear and sadness. It was clear now. This wasn't just a man confronting her. This was about history, legacy, decisions made in office, actions interpreted and reinterpreted by the public. This man, whoever he was, represented years of public dissatisfaction consolidated into one combustible moment. The crowd, no longer passive, began whispering. A teenage boy pulled out his phone and started recording. Within seconds, others followed. Notebooks stayed shut. Hands no longer reached for newspaper pages. All eyes were on the unfolding scene. "That's Pam Bondi," someone said under their breath. "Is that the attorney lady?" another voice added. "I understand that you're angry," she said. "And I understand that my name, my work, might be tied to things that hurt you or someone you care about. But standing here, yelling at me at a bus stop, tells me one thing. It's not just about me. It's bigger than that." More cameras recorded. More people paid attention, not just to the man, but to her, how she handled herself, how she didn't escalate, how she didn't walk away. "It takes courage to speak up," Pam said, "but it takes more to listen. I've never claimed perfection. I've never said I got everything right. But I still believe we can talk like people, not enemies." That sentence lingered. The crowd seemed to sense the weight of it. The man looked at her, some part of him desperate to stay angry, but the heat of the moment was starting to dissolve. His breathing slowed, his shoulders loosening. Still enraged, perhaps. Still justified in his emotion, but recognizing that maybe shouting wasn't the solution either. Finally, without another word, he turned around and pushed through the crowd. No one stopped him. No one applauded. No one booed. It was just silence. Silence filled with a kind of shaken respect for the restraint of the woman who stood her ground, and for the complexity of a moment tied to history, policy, and deep-seated emotion. Pam stood still for a moment longer. She looked down at the pavement, then around at the people. For a flash, their emotion-filled expressions matched her own inner thoughts. She wasn't just a name on a screen to them. She was here, human, real, and susceptible to every judgment and misunderstanding that came with being in the public eye. She adjusted the strap of her purse gently, looking down the street to see the approaching bus. And as the crowd began to thin, and the buzzing city resumed its rhythm, she stepped forward with quiet dignity. The incident was over, but its meaning wouldn't fade so easily. The small crowd grew. What had started as just a few curious glances turned quickly into a circle of strangers, all drawn by the unmistakable sound of a man shouting in anger. Phones were out, fingers tapping record buttons. Some stood still, their eyes locked on the confrontation unfolding at the bus stop, while others quietly whispered to each other, trying to piece together what was going on without being too obvious. "Isn't that Pam Bondi?" Someone muttered with narrowed eyes, angling their phone just right to get her in frame. "Why is that guy yelling at her like that?" A younger man asked aloud, clearly puzzled. His friend shrugged but kept filming, sensing something juicy even if he didn't fully understand it. "She's that lawyer, right? Politician too." People didn't need the context. The image was too powerful. A man yelling with fury. A woman standing composed but pressed. The scene looked like outrage versus authority, pain versus control. True or not, that was the narrative already forming through the lens of smartphones and perceptions. Pam tried again. This time, she spoke louder, more clearly, hoping to break through. "I'm not here to fight with you. If you have something to say, I'll listen. But this shouting, is not going to make anything better for either of us." The man barked out a short, bitter laugh. "You listening to anyone? That's a joke. Just like everything else." His rage seemed to vibrate from his chest, his fists now opening and closing as though he was trying, barely, to keep himself from crossing some invisible line. And yet, still, she didn't move, didn't lash back. Nearby passers-by drew closer, magnetized by the confrontation. Some wore concern on their faces. Others were merely intrigued. But nobody intervened. Still holding her posture, Pam narrowed her eyes slightly. She wasn't angry, but she was ready. "You should speak your truth. But not like this. Not here. You've turned what could have been a conversation into a spectacle." Those words stopped the man, only slightly. Paused him, as if he hadn't expected her to hit back with calmness. His expression faltered for a second, revealing something deeper. The public rage folded briefly into something more human, hurt, frustration, maybe a wound she hadn't caused but had unknowingly walked into. Still, his voice came again, slightly restrained. "You're the kind of person who smiles while people lose their homes. You smile when policies ruin families. You defend the worst people, and then you expect people like me to stay silent when you're standing in front of us like nothing happened." This was personal. Or at least it felt personal to him. His face was closer now, but no longer shouting. The trembling finger had lowered. His chest still heaved from the built-up emotion, the adrenaline now steadying into something more confrontable. She finally responded with something softer. "What did she even do?" came a voice from the side, curious, perhaps skeptical. As the volume of the man's shouting filled the air around them, the crowd began to split, not physically, but emotionally. There were those who sympathized with Pam, watching her stand quietly while verbal blows rained down on her, and then those who, knowingly or not, began siding with the angry man just because of his passion, his raw energy, his desperate tone. No real information had been shared. No clear references to an event, a law, or a turning point Pam had or hadn't influenced. But many didn't care. In a world constantly choosing headlines over depth, optics over understanding, the reasons behind the shouting didn't seem as urgent as the drama of it happening at all. The more the man ranted, the more the line between fact and emotion blurred. What did she do? Was it real? Was it fair? Was this man unstable? Or was this just a socially inappropriate moment of truth? Suddenly, a woman from the crowd stepped forward. Dressed in business attire, perhaps heading to work like everyone else, she must have weighed a dozen arguments in her head before deciding to speak. She didn't raise her voice, didn't attack the man, but her presence alone quieted the scene for a moment. "This isn't the place or time for this kind of attack," she said calmly, her voice firm but respectful, layered with a trace of concern. "Whatever your grievance is, there's a respectful way to talk about it." The man turned to her, eyes blazing with disbelief, and barked back, "She doesn't deserve respect." The crowd reacted audibly to that. A few gasped. Others exchanged glances. Even in a digital age desensitized by online rage, there was still discomfort in hearing that kind of raw personal hatred spoken out loud in real life, to someone's face. Pam's eyes flicked toward the woman who'd stepped in, silently acknowledging the moment of support. Then she addressed the man again. Her voice was calm, steady. Not loud, but it carried weight. "Whatever you're upset about, I'm happy to hear you out," she said, "but this behavior is not okay." There was no condescension in her tone, no superiority, and no panic, just composure, the kind people crave in tense, escalating moments when no one else knows what to do. She took a subtle step back, not out of fear, but as a boundary, a signal that the discussion, if it were to continue, would need to do so within the limits of decency. She met his eyes, not with challenge, but with resolve. You could feel it. Even the people watching from the edges, phones held midair, noticed the shift. Despite being the subject of a public breakdown, she didn't retaliate. She didn't yell or accuse. She didn't flee. She stood her ground. It was this quiet resistance that cracked something in the scene. The man hesitated. His mouth opened, then shut. His hand, which had been pointing or gesturing wildly, slowly lowered to his side. He looked around, suddenly aware of the crowd circling him. Aware of the eyes on him, the camera phones pointed his way, capturing not just his anger, but his loss of control. By now, the crowd wasn't just watching, it was judging. Some expressed it with furrowed brows, others with crossed arms, a few shaking their heads slowly in silence, as if second-hand embarrassment had caught up to them on his behalf. Pam stayed quiet, giving him space to rethink, to retreat, to recover, whatever needed to happen. She didn't press her moment. She didn't turn to the crowd for validation. What she had done, simply by responding without aggression, had more power than 1,000 heated rebuttals. And the man felt it. "You people never listen," he said, softer now. "You smile in front of cameras and expect us to forget everything you stood for." He still believed in what had driven him to shout, but now even he could feel the line between righteous anger and public collapse approaching. Pam replied, gently but without flinching. "Listening is what I'm doing right now," she said. "You just haven't told me anything I can respond to. You're angry, I hear that. But if you want things to change, you talk to people. You don't tear them down in the street." The crowd continued to grow still, as if time had slowed. Most people had probably imagined themselves in scenarios like this, being publicly attacked, records running online, a moment possibly going viral. But few imagined being the person who stayed patient, who didn't match volume with volume. In that moment, Pam had said more with her silence and composure than any press conference ever could. She wasn't there to win the argument. She wasn't there to be vindicated by the crowd. She was simply showing that restraint, a response so many lacked, was still possible even in the digital age of outrage. The woman who had initially stepped in, still standing nearby, nodded slightly. She hadn't been thanked, but didn't need to be. Something about what she'd done, and what Pam was doing, transcended verbal approval. Others began to turn away as the man backed off, if not in spirit, then physically. He muttered something under his breath, spiteful but quieter, and stepped out of the circle of attention. He had lost his audience. Pam stayed a moment longer, steady in place. No tears, no outburst, no retreat. Just grace enough to see the moment through. Eventually, the train of daily life resumed. Buses pulled in and out. People returned to their own worlds, shaken and maybe changed, or maybe just entertained, but definitely affected. What they had witnessed wasn't just another public argument. It was a reminder that the world rarely pauses, but sometimes, in one brief, uncomfortable moment, it asks us, who are we under pressure? How do we respond when the world watches? Pam Bondi's answer didn't need a microphone. She handled it in plain daylight, with no one to stop the storm, except herself. Just when it seemed like the situation might spiral completely out of control, when voices were high, the tension palpable, and even the bystanders looked uncertain about whether to intervene. A figure emerged from the crowd, a man who, until that moment, had been standing silently at the edge of the confrontation, stepped forward. He was a middle-aged commuter, dressed casually in jeans and a buttoned shirt with a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Perhaps he was heading to work, or maybe just running errands, but something in him compelled him to act. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried a kind of weight. Calm, grounded. "Hey," he said, not in a confrontational tone, but with quiet strength, addressing the angry man who had until now dominated the sidewalk with rage. "This isn't helping anyone. Venting like this in public, against someone who's not even raising her voice. This isn't strength. This is just making a scene." The effect was immediate. The furious man, so caught up in the heat of his emotions, blinked as if pulled from a trance. His focus, which had been tunneling rage toward Pam Bondi, abruptly widened. Now he noticed the crowd more clearly. The phones, the faces, no longer entertained or sympathetic, but tense and wary. Judging even, he glanced around, first at the phones still filming, then at the people watching in stunned silence or head-shaking disbelief. He could feel the shift, that subtle but unmistakable tipping point when the audience no longer saw him as a man bravely speaking truth, but simply another person crumbling under the weight of their own emotion in the public eye. There was hesitation in his stance now. The tight clench of his shoulders relaxed just enough to show that he noticed the moment had turned. The anger hadn't vanished, but its fuel, belief that he had moral support from those around him, was fading quickly. He looked again at Pam, who was still standing with dignity, still silent, eyes steady. She hadn't responded with the sharpness she very well could have. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't yelled back. She hadn't stormed off. She had stayed, holding her ground with calm that now put him to shame more than any shouted rebuttal could have. His shoulders sagged slightly, and a weight that had been bubbling inside seemed to collapse inward. The man let out a long breath. It wasn't an apology. He didn't offer closure. But there was recognition there, of boundaries crossed, of a line stepped over, of something within himself that perhaps he hadn't intended to expose so completely to a crowd of strangers. Without meeting any more eyes, he shook his head and turned around. His steps were slower now. The anger had drained, replaced by something closer to resignation. He muttered something low under his breath, frustration, self-justification, or perhaps simply shame, and silently walked away. The crowd parted slightly to let him pass, eyes following him until he was out of view. And just like that, the tension seemed to release, almost tangibly, from the space. A breeze moved quietly through the bus stop, rustling paper napkins left near a bench, as though the world itself could finally exhale. Pam stood still for a moment more, still catching her breath, not from fear, but from riding the emotional storm with every fiber of composure she had. The pink of her dress still brightened the scene, but now it seemed to carry added meaning. Composure, resilience, grace under fire. She took a quiet breath in, then another. Her fingers, which had curled defensively around the strap of her purse, gently relaxed. She looked around, not with scorn or vengeance, but with clarity. And then she spoke. "Let this be a moment," she said, her voice calm and clear as it reached every corner of the gathered crowd. A reminder that aggressive words in public places might make headlines, but kindness, she paused slightly, gathering final emphasis, will always echo louder. There was a strange stillness after that, like the pause at the end of a powerful scene in a film. No one rushed to respond. No one shouted. There was simply silence, for a second or two, then the subtle sound of people beginning to nod, to quietly agree. A woman near the front softly clapped her hands together once, then again. Another joined in. It wasn't a loud ovation, but rather a quiet affirmation of what they had just witnessed. People began murmuring again, the spell breaking slowly. Conversations resumed in low, reflective tones. Some put away their phones. A few stayed longer, hoping to offer words of encouragement or simply observe how things settled. The middle-aged man who had stepped in earlier gave a faint nod to Pam before turning and disappearing into the crowd, his presence no longer needed. And others followed, peeling off into the rhythm of the day, walking to work, boarding buses, checking their phones once more. Pam took one more look around, her expression unreadable but firm. She had not responded to attack with retaliation. She had not tried to control what people thought of her. She had only chosen how she would respond, and that choice had spoken louder than anything else. Though no official apology came and no headlines the next day would quote the stranger with the kind voice, the story lived on. Not because of high drama or scandal, but because it was real, raw, human. Video clips would later surface on social media. Comment sections would debate their version of the event. Some would still criticize. Others would defend. But a large part of the discussion would center not on the outburst, but on the response. Dignity is power, one user would write under a shared clip. That woman handled herself better than most of us ever could. And perhaps that was the legacy of that short-lived confrontation, a public reminder that how we respond in moments of tension reveals far more about character than any title, reputation, or history ever can. Not perfection, not performance, but patience, self-control, and respect, even when it isn't returned. At the end of the day, the buses kept moving, the city kept buzzing, and the world, as always, moved on. But some moments stay. This one would linger, not for the anger that tried to dominate it, but for the calm strength that stood taller. Later that evening, as the city began winding down and the golden tones of dusk settled over the skyline, something unexpected happened. Social media platforms lit up with videos from the bus stop incident. Captured from multiple angles, each clip showed the same central moment. A man shouting furiously, finger pointed, voice raised, and facing him, Pam Bondi, silent, poised, composed. Within hours, the footage spread from local groups to larger news aggregators. Headlines varied. Some described the scene with words like chaotic and explosive. Others called it a political confrontation, a bold challenge, or even a reckoning. But amidst the sensationalism, a clear pattern emerged in the public discourse. Comment sections filled with reactions, some critical, others deeply empathetic. A portion of viewers watched the videos and questioned Pam's political legacy, as expected with any public figure subjected to scrutiny. They referenced past cases, decisions, and affiliations. But while some attempted to reduce the encounter to a simple battle of right versus wrong, many more focused on something else entirely, the way Pam had handled herself. It wasn't the shouting that people were drawn to. It wasn't the finger-pointing or the emotional intensity of the man's words. It was the stillness, the calm, the quiet. In an age where conflict often makes headlines and outrage is amplified louder than reason, it was the lack of retaliation that struck a chord. Pam didn't shout back. She didn't defend herself with venom. She didn't accuse or deflect or walk away in a storm of indignation. Instead, she listened. She stood her ground. She responded with control, not because she had rehearsed it, but because she chose restraint, even when restraint was hard. People across platforms commented on it. "I don't care what your politics are. This woman handled that better than I ever could." One comment read, echoed by thousands of likes. Another user posted, "You don't have to agree with someone to treat them with decency." That goes both ways. Through the haze of moral judgments and heated debates, a universal truth had emerged. Composure under fire commands respect. It doesn't matter if people are cheering for your downfall or shouting your failures in public. What matters is how you handle the moment. Pam didn't try to win the crowd. She didn't seek applause or validation. She just stood, with grace, with strength, and with the unwillingness to let anger pull her off center. That was what people remembered. And that, more than anything, was what made her response powerful. In today's digital culture, public figures are no strangers to confrontation. Anyone with notoriety is subject to opinions, heat, and judgment handed out by strangers who only know them through headlines or soundbites. Often these confrontations are met with equal ferocity, clapbacks on Twitter, aggressive defenses in interviews, or attempts to erase the conversation entirely. But Pam took a different path. She stood without pride, but also without apology. Not because she believed she'd done nothing wrong, but because she understood that being human in the spotlight meant accepting criticism, listening even when it hurt, and refusing to match hate with more hate. For many who watched the videos from that afternoon, it became clear that this wasn't a scene from a typical confrontation. This wasn't two people shouting back and forth while a crowd gathered, rooting for chaos and viral soundbites. It was a one-sided storm that met a wall of quiet strength. And that silence said what words never could. Respect is not given based on agreement. It's granted when someone shows character. And in that moment, Pam Bondi didn't wear her title. She didn't hide behind credentials. She met outrage with patience, and that patience turned the tide of the entire situation. The man who had yelled so powerfully, who had stood brimming with rage, eventually lost the support of the crowd, not because he was entirely wrong in his frustrations, but because of the way he delivered them. His failure wasn't in feeling, but in expression. He didn't speak truth as much as he unleashed fury, and when fury is all someone sees, the message is lost. In contrast, Pam's body language, with shoulders relaxed, voice steady, and gaze unwavering, communicated something deeper than argument. She was not there to be liked or defended. She was simply holding herself accountable to her own values, facing the moment as it was, and determining not to lose her own dignity in the process. The next morning, the conversation continued. Editorials praised her composure. Podcasts discussed the broader meaning of civility, especially in political discourse. Some used the moment to reflect on how public figures should interact with criticism, while others turned the lens on society, challenging the notion that screaming your truth is always the most effective way to be heard. What people witnessed wasn't just about politics, one journalist wrote. It was a reminder that we all have choices in how we respond to pressure. Some shout louder, some walk away, and some, like she did, choose to stand still and let silence speak. As the days passed, the video faded from trending lists. Share counts plateaued. New headlines emerged, and the public's gaze shifted, as it always does, to fresh controversies and viral moments. But for those who witnessed it, either in person or online, the event remained etched not for what was said, but for what wasn't. Pam never posted about the incident. There were no tweets, no press releases, no interviews designed to reshape the story. There was no blame directed toward the man who confronted her, no commentary on whether his outrage was justified. Instead, she let her response stand on its own. That decision, too, was noted. People began citing the moment not as a political victory or defeat, but as a lesson. In schools, in leadership webinars, in conversations around family dinner tables, the footage was shared. Not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something quiet and rare. The power of restraint. The simplicity of listening. The reminder that just because someone yells does not mean you have to yell back. That respect is not weakness. That kindness, even in response to confrontation, is not surrender, but strength in its purest form. So what did the moment really teach? For many, it confirmed that in a time when people are constantly prompted to respond first and think second, there is greater worth in a measured breath, in listening, in standing tall without feeding the fire. And most of all, it revealed that character is not shown when everything is peaceful, but when everything is noisy. Pam Bondi, in that moment, didn't just demonstrate self-control. She demonstrated leadership, without a podium, without a microphone, and without needing anyone to agree. Because sometimes, leading is simply choosing not to become the very thing you're facing. What would you have done in that situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to push pin like, speech balloon comment, and repeat button share this story if it made you think. And don't forget to subscribe to FameX, where imagination and truth collide in the most unexpected ways.